Okay, so here we are in part 2 of Lab 3, and we're using a skeleton plot to discover the age of a Pueblo ruin. In the introduction, you learned that in order to connect a tree ring record from historical wood to that of living trees, Douglas and his team would have had to find additional historical wood that existed around 1000 AD. In 1921, Douglas and his team unearthed an interesting beam in a ruin at Show Low, Arizona. This piece of wood shown below, being wrapped by Douglas's assistant, turned out to be a key that made it possible to tie historical record to the present day and assign actual calendar dates to historical pueblos across the U.S. Southwest. It was the missing link. It allowed Douglas to develop a tree ring chronology for the region. A tree ring chronology is a series of annual values derived from the ring width measurements of 20 or more trees of the same species at a single site. To create a tree ring chronology cores from the sampled trees at each site, they're cross-dated, which is a technique that ensures each individual tree ring is assigned to its exact year of formation by matching patterns of wide and narrow rings between cores from the same tree and between trees from different locations. This is accomplished by matching patterns of wide and narrow rings between cores from the same tree and between trees of different locations. To see this process in action, watch the historical footage of A. E. Douglas at work cross-dating samples.
Tree rings were the first proxy records researched by the scientific community. In the late 19th century, Andrew Ellicott Douglas pioneered the study of tree rings in Flagstaff, Arizona.
Douglas was a very good observer. He was just a guy who noticed stuff. And he saw these patterns of broad and narrow rings on the ponderosa pine stumps, and he figured that these were characteristic patterns related to the climate conditions of each year. He took that and developed some rather simple but good tools for matching those patterns, for seeing if there's a common pattern. And that's what the scientific use of tree rings is based on. In the late 30s, he persuaded the Arizona Board of Regents to establish the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research as a department of the university. It's on the basis of that it became possible for numerous colleagues in different countries and across different parts of North America to join together to build continental scale networks of tree ring data.
You might imagine that to learn anything in science, you need to collect reams of data and use mathematics, statistics, and graphs to derive meaningful results. In some cases, however, useful information can also be obtained using qualitative means. In this activity, you will use qualitative methodology to create a skeleton plot, which you'll learn about below, from a scanned image of a sample of western juniper. You'll then use the plot you created to compare to one created by the scientist to date the Pueblo. You'll be doing exactly what Neil Jude and pioneering dendrochronologist A. E. Douglas did after collecting this piece of supporting beam from a kiva in Pueblo Bonita in 1922. So to do this, you would need a piece of millimeter graph paper, which if you're online, you're not going to have. So we're just going to go through and I'm going to explain the process to you instead. Building skeleton plots is a useful strategy for accurately marking calendar dates on each ring of your tree sample. Through skeleton plotting, scientists are able to compare ring patterns of different samples and assign an exact calendar date to each ring. Right-click on the link for tree ring dating video for an explanation of how to make a skeleton plot and compare your plot to a master tree ring chronology, which is composed of many tree ring samples. So let's watch this video here.
Hi, I'm Ron Towner. I'm a dendrochronologist. Dendrochronology is based on the idea that trees in temperate latitudes grow one ring and only one ring a year, and the width of that ring is dependent on the amount of rainfall. So we start with a sample of wood or charcoal. We have to prepare the wood surface in particular so that we can see the individual cells within each ring. Then we start plotting those narrow rings from the inside to the outside of the sample. Say ring number 2 is small, we put a line on the graph paper and develop that pattern. We take that plot and we compare it with hundreds of other trees that grew through the same time period. We call that a master chronology. In the southwest, our master chronologies go back to 322 BC. In skeleton plotting, we're not measuring the rings at all. What we're doing is using the graph paper to represent those rings, and we only mark the small rings. And it's that pattern of small rings that allows us to date the samples against a master chronology. We slide the sample along the master, and we need to match up all those little lines. So right there. So we now know that tree was cut in 1998. Virtually all societies use wood in some fashion. That provides us with materials that we can tree ring. One of archaeology's greatest strengths is its time depth. We can look at how cultures change over time. Tree rings help us do that in a very precise way by dating the samples to an exact year.
Okay. Let's make a skeleton plot for Pueblo Bonito. You'll be creating roughly a 60-year skeleton plot for a section of the sample below. You must zoom in significantly to see each ring. Look at the image of the tree core sample below. Note that the bark off of the tree would have been on the right side of the image. Although no bark is visible, had there been bark, you would have been able to count backwards from the bark on one ring at a time to find the age of the tree. Zoom in so you can see a series of dots. To make analysis a simpler process, scientists place 1 mark per decade, 10 tree rings, 2 marks per 50 years, and 3 marks at the century mark. Select a section of the core that contains 6 decades of the ring to study. Do not choose the very first interval from the center of the core to the first dot. The first series of rings is difficult to analyze. As shown in the video linked to above, each mark of the x-axis on your graph paper will be equal to 1 ring, or 1 year of growth. Each vertical line on your graph paper will be corresponding to 1 ring of the sample. Each vertical line on your graph paper will correspond. The various heights of the lines will be drawn for those lines which are narrower, with the narrowest line in the sequence given the longest line. Normal rings are left undrawn. So here is the sample that you would have been drawing. And I probably would have had this all printed out for you so that you would be able to match this up and just go on down the line with your paper as you marked everything off. So you don't want to start with these ones. You can start, somewhere around here or here. Look at the sequence of rings you have chosen to decide what the width of the average ring is. You'll be ignoring all of those rings and focusing on the narrowest rings. Remember that these data are determined by comparing each ring to each nearest neighbors. Go through your tree ring sequence and mark the narrow rings on your skeleton plot with a pencil. So after you're finished drawing out all your lines, you'd go back in and you would mark the narrow rings down. When you get to a single or a sequence of narrow rings, mark a tall line for the narrowest and proportionately shorter lines for the others in the same grouping. See the example below. So looking at this one, this would have been the narrowest ring, and then these ones would be a little bit wider than this one. Dating the timber sample. In this part of the activity, you'll compare your skeleton plot to the one produced by Richard Warren and his colleagues in 1971 to determine the age of the wood sample. They used the same technique dendrochronologists used to derive the actual dates during the ancestral Pueblo people lived in Pueblo Bonito. The task is to cross-date or match your set of lines to the ones that Warren had. So this is what Warren's sample looked like. And this would not have been the same exact sample for the tree that you would have been doing, but again, I'm not having you actually try to go in and do that since we don't have millimeter graph paper and we're not in school. But you can see the longer lines here would mean that this is a very narrow ring, and then the shorter ones would indicate some of the wider rings. So you would have to slide your piece of paper up and down that other one until you found lines that matched. So what are the beginning and ending dates of the 60-year plot? We are just going to be looking at his here, since we are online. So this particular tree, we would say, was cut down in 1963. The beginning date, so it says what are the beginning and ending dates. I know it says of your 60-year skeleton plot, but we're just going to do the beginning and ending dates of his plot, so it's a little bit more than 60 years. So it's difficult to tell what that one says there. I know this is 750, 1428, looks like. So 1428 maybe is the beginning of it. Up to June of 663. Well, this is AD. So go from 750 AD all the way up to 963 AD. This particular piece of wood was cut down in 963 AD. How old was the tree when it was cut down? Question number 3. So you would take 963 and you're going to subtract that from about 750. That'll be your answer for number 3. And for number 4, how close did your plot match to the Warren plot? How did your plot compare to your classmates? And what do you think caused any differences in your work? So since you didn't actually do this, think about what would happen if you had done it. Anytime you have an experiment, there's always a little bit of experimental error. And what would that experimental error have been from? Maybe your interpretation of the thickness of the tree lines would have been different than, what he thought. Maybe your long bands for your narrow strands wouldn't have been as long as his long bands for his narrow strands. So that would be some differences. Maybe you think that a plot is more narrow, so you draw a longer line, but he didn't think that, or what have you. And that could have been the same for your classmates as well. All right, and that's where we'll stop with this for today. We'll do part 3 next.